My name is Yannick Lefebvre. I'm a plugin developer. Some of you might know me as the plugin guy over the years. I've been presenting here 4 years in a row. And what I'm going to be talking about this year is a talk that I've entitled Plugins, a Double-Edged Sword. So as opposed to my prior talks that were more about plugin development, here I'm going to talk more about plugins from the user or integrator perspective. The topics that I'll be covering in this talk, first I'll just give you a quick introduction about who I am. Then I'll talk about the power of plugins and the wild nature of plugins. So the good and bad of working with plugins within a WordPress installation. Then I'm going to be talking about general site building strategies. As you go and put up your site, I look at adding functionality. What should be the strategies that you should be following to be able to make sure that you have a successful project in your hands. Then I'll talk about some more specific troubleshooting techniques. So different tips and tricks that I've learned over the years as I've been helping my users work with my plugins, but also with the wide variety of plugins that are out there. How do you go about trying to find who the culprit is or how to resolve an issue when they come up? I'll talk about then handling problematic updates. So once in a while you might get an update that doesn't work. Well, how do you go back and get back on your feet when that happens? Finally, I'm going to cover how to avoid bad plugin breakups and wrap things up. So, a few words about me. As I mentioned, I'm a plugin developer. I've been using WordPress since 2004. So, as you might know, this year was the 10th anniversary of WordPress. So I started just a little bit after it started. I released my very first plugin, which was called Link Library, in 2005. So again, a long time ago. So I've been developing plugins and making them evolve as the platform has been growing over time and giving plugin developers more and more capabilities. To date, I have 8 plugins that are on the repository and various levels of popularity amongst these plugins. But a common theme is that I have people that are relying on these plugins to be able to build their websites and who try to figure out sometimes, well, how do you get all these plugins to coexist properly on their web page? And that's really what the topic of this talk is going to be. So talking a little bit about the power of plugins. Plugins are really awesome, and that's one of the first things that drew me to WordPress. The ability to add these custom code modules inside of WordPress to be able to enhance its capabilities beyond what came out of the box. The ability to add extra content, to add new functionality to the platform has always been something that's been at the core of WordPress. It's also components that can help you modify, enhance the behavior. So if there's things that you want to make better than what's available there, there's all these mechanisms that let plugin developers go in and really add a lot of capability inside of the platform. Plugins can also be used to simplify tasks. So there are things that out of the box aren't necessarily the easiest things to do within WordPress, so there are plugins that can help you really get things to be simpler for your day-to-day use and for the users that are going to be using the platform that you put together. The other great strength of plugins is that it allows integrators to create custom content for their customers without having to touch the core of the WordPress code. So there's a lot of companies that add their own value to a WordPress installation by creating their own plugins, being able to create a full platform for the end customer, and then be able to keep all that code, all that functionality nicely tied up in a plugin that they can just upgrade and migrate from version to version in WordPress. Other strengths of plugins, well, there's a very large developer community out there. To date, there are more than 25,000 plugins that are available on the repository, and that does not even include all of the premium plugins that exist out there. So there's a lot to choose from when you're looking at building a website. Now, with all of these virtues, well, plugins also have some disadvantages or some things that you need to be aware of that they're not necessarily always easy to work with. The first of these points is that they're only available when you're working on a self-hosted installation of WordPress. So I've often had conversation with friends who were asking me to help them with their WordPress use and wanted to add extra functionality. And then I told them which plugins they could go to be able to add that functionality until they told me that they were on .com. So I just need to say here that they're only on self-hosted installs. There is no enforced coding standard. So in that way, plugins are a bit of the Wild West. it's possible for anyone to go in and submit a plugin ID and then be able to get their own space on WordPress.org to be able to publish that plugin. But nowhere in there does it say how you should go about coding your plugin, and no one verifies how that plugin is put together. So there can be varying levels of quality inside of these plugins, as well as different levels of performance. So this all kind of comes together. Really, when you're dealing with a plugin, you could be dealing with a very well-seasoned programmer who's been doing this for a while, or you might be dealing with someone who's managed to do something in PHP, but without necessarily knowing what's the best way of doing it. There are no code reviews for any of the plugins that go up on WordPress.org. So if a plugin writes something, sometimes makes some mistakes, uploads his plugin on the official site, it'll get distributed, and there's no mechanism in there to check if the code actually works. So that's always something that can be a bit difficult to work with. And that includes when you're first installing a plugin or when you get updates. So sometimes you go through your regular update routine, you see that you have a number of plugins that do have new versions out, and when you go and you run that update and then something doesn't quite go right. And that's part of what I'll talk here is how do you handle these plugin updates that don't go right. Last but not least, it's hard to predict how a plugin will interact with the website itself, so the WordPress site and the theme that you chose, as well as other plugins that you might have. There's really an infinite number of combinations out there of plugins that a user could look at using and installing together on a website, and how these will coexist, it's not always easy to tell. So in the end, when you're working with plugins, you know, your website might feel a little bit unstable. You know that you kind of have what you want, but you don't know if the extra thing you're going to add is what's going to make the whole thing fall down. Even if it's not falling down, sometimes you know that things aren't as good as they could be. And so what I'll be talking about here is all about, well, how do you build a website that's a lot more stable? So let's start with some site building strategies. The first one is to perform due diligence on a plugin. So before you go and even look at downloading that plugin, at using it, take a look at the WordPress.org site and look at some of the stats on that plugin. Of course, this you're not going to see if you're installing directly through the admin page. You'll get the star rating, but that's about it. But do follow the link that's available there to go to the WordPress.org site and take a look at some of the more complete stats that are over there. So some of the things you'll see is, for example, version compatibility. That's going to be shown at the very top, saying in this case it supports version 3.5 or higher. And at the very bottom is this section where users can actually say that between a given version of WordPress and a given version of a plugin, whether or not that combination works. So it's always a good thing to take a look at, okay, it's going to work on my version. Another good indicator is number of downloads. This is Contact Form 7, just to name it. It has a very large number of downloads. Typically, plugins that work well and that have a good user base will have high download counts, so that's always a good indicator of whether or not you want to get that plugin for your site. Positive and negative ratings, so these nice star ratings here. Yes, anybody can go in there, anybody with a WordPress.org account, and rate the plugin. So going in there, seeing that you have a plugin with a high rating, can also be a good confidence builder to know that this will be something that could be good for your website. And finally, something that got added recently is the number of resolved threads. That's showing up down here. This will show you how many support tickets were opened around that plugin and how many of them have been resolved by the author. Now, I should note here that this is not necessarily the most reliable thing, because either the author of the thread on the support forum or the author of the plugin has to go through the effort of actually closing all these threads, and that doesn't always happen. But it can give you a general idea of how responsive the author is going to be. So if you do have a question about that plugin, you can know if you're going to get an answer, or what are the chances that you'll get that answer. Next, I'd say, still before installing your plugin, take a look at what it's supposed to do. I mean, sometimes a quick description, that's one thing, but look at any documentation that's available for the plugin. Look at any examples that are available, if there's screenshots, if there's an example website that shows you what that plugin will do once installed. These are things that will give you a better idea of whether or not you like what you're seeing before you go and install that plugin on your website and then realize it, remove it. So it's going to save you a few steps there. The ultimate way of testing a plugin, once you've selected which one you want to use, is to create your own development site before you deploy. So I covered a bit of that in my talk last year, but there are ways basically that you can install a local web server on your machine, or ways for you to create a subdomain or a subdirectory on your production site and install a separate copy of WordPress over there. Then look at installing the plugins that you want to try out inside of that installation, and then see how things work out. That's always a safer approach than just deploying it on your production site, activating it, and then getting user error messages or anything unsightly show up on your web page. Next point, only install one plugin at a time if you can. That'll really help you to be able to troubleshoot things or really figure out who's going to be the culprit if there is a problem that shows up on your web page. If you install 5 at a time, it's going to be a lot harder to go in and dig and figure out what might have happened. Next point on site building strategies. Measure site performance before and after your plugin installation. That one might sound a bit strange, but I was talking a bit earlier about the fact that there's no coding standard, there's no code reviews. What that also means is that there could be code in there that could be taking a lot of time on your system, on your website, for no reason. And so you should look at a few different things. You should look at how fast your web page renders before and after in terms of front-end facing pages, so the pages that the visitors are going to see. You should also look at the admin pages on the back end. A concrete example, I had a user who installed a plugin to do backups on his website. His front end worked great, no problems, but the admin pages, even when he was not running a backup, became about 3 times slower. Why? Well, there was something in that code. I didn't dig to find out exactly what it was, but there was something in that code that would only get called when the administrator would be logged in, and that would and visiting the admin pages, and that would run in the back, and that was slowing down the admin to a point where it was hard to work with the website. The other thing I should mention here is you should also look at logging out and looking at the front-facing visitor performance as well. The reason for that is that within plugin code, you can have plugin code execute if there's a user who's logged in or if there isn't one. So again, there could be differences depending on how the author created the plugin that could really make a difference whether or not you're actually logged into the website. So now we get into troubleshooting plugin issues. And so, well, you've installed a plugin, even you went one at a time, but you have a problem. That problem could be a number of things. Your website could be completely broken, the white page of death. Or you could have another problem. Your menus could no longer work. Some other plugin that you had on your website no longer works. A few examples of what could happen. First thing you should do, deactivate the last plugin installed. Sounds obvious, but it's the first thing to try. Things should normally go back to normal after you do that. Next, deactivate all the other plugins and bring them back one at a time to figure out what the conflict is. So if you have one new element you added, you removed it, you're back to normal. Okay, but then what's the problem? Is it a problem between the theme and your plugin, or is it 2 plugins that are clashing together? So by doing it one at a time or combinations, you'll figure out which one it is. Next, visit the official plugin page. Again, if you're downloading a plugin from the WordPress backend, so from the admin pages, well, it's all great. You can do a quick search, you can install it, but what you might be missing if you're doing that are installation procedures. Sometimes the author might have said, well, you need to do a few things after you activate the plugin, and you'll find that information on the plugin's webpage. There's usually an installation tab. You go in there and you'll get instructions on what to do to get that plugin up and running. What you'll also find on that page are FAQs, so various questions that might come up often that the author of the plugin has put in there to help out users. So if you're just trying to get the plugin up and running, something ain't right, it might be described here in the FAQ what to do. Finally, you have the support forum, so you could look at the forum to see if the issue you're having already came up and was already resolved, or you could get in touch with the author. Most plugin authors are pretty responsive. Not all, but most are. And so they'll be able to try to help you out to get you up and running. Now, there's different kinds of issues that could come up when you're working with getting all these plugins together. The first one is styling problems. So there's a lot of plugins that look at adding content to your website, whether it's through a shortcode, a widget. Many of them are going to try to render something on the web page, and that's great. It lets you add extra content and manage that content using great tools. But then there can be conflicts. A lot of these plugins are going to have their own styling, their own style sheet with the plugin to be able to decide how things are going to be laid out. Now, these style sheets don't always like to agree with other style sheets. That includes all of your other plugins as well as your theme. So an example here from a user of one of my plugins is they brought up the plugin, and it was a plugin to let you manage your links and add your own links. And so they ended up with this big black block here. The reason was, basically within their theme, they had table header cells defined to have this very dark color. Normal table data cells were fine, but the table header cells weren't. And the way they had described it, their theme had priority over what was defined by the plugin, so they ended up with this strange look on the screen. I should mention here that a great tool to figure out who's winning in terms of when you're looking at a style sheet and you're trying to figure out between all these different style sheets which one is the one that has priority, using Firebug is always a great way to be able to go in there and really see a full listing of all of the styles that are being applied to the content and being able to find out which one is being overridden. So there's two different ways you can address a styling problem. The first one is to modify the theme. Now, that being said, there's a lot of users who don't know their theme well enough to be able to do that. They're going to start to look at the theme, they might have an idea of how to look at the style sheet, but they're going to get to a point where they're not going to be sure what else will be affected by changing a line inside of that style sheet. The other kind of change you can make is on the plugin side. So on the plugin, you can look at where the style sheet lives and try to modify it. Now, the first thing that I'll say here is, as much as possible, you should try to avoid changing your plugin's files. The reason behind that is that an update will just overwrite any change that you've made inside of these files. What you should try to do, well, if there's no other way around it, you should at least look at backing up these files that you've modified. So make a copy of it, then reapply that backed up copy the next time that you do an update. Now, some plugins have a style sheet editor, so in that case, it's quite easy. You can just go in the style sheet editor, modify what its style is, and then be able to go on. When you're doing these kind of changes at the plugin level, and you get in a situation like the one that I described where the theme had priority, the #important CSS keyword is going to be very useful for you so that you can say that, well, this styling characteristic of the plugin should take priority over the ones that are defined inside of the theme. The next one, which is always fun, is troubleshooting jQuery issues. So jQuery, if you're not familiar with it, is a very popular JavaScript library that powers most of the animated things that you're going to see on websites today. So we're talking about things like those rolling menus that you have, things like AJAX queries where you have things that will pop into your website when you take an action. So all of these elements are powered by jQuery. Now, while jQuery is a really powerful library, it's also very easy to make it break. And so jQuery conflicts can occur when you have a theme, more than one plugin. Many of them could be trying to do things with jQuery, and that's when you're going to start to get into issues. Now, one conflict within this jQuery can typically just take down your whole, all of your jQuery-related elements. So it won't take down your whole site, but anything that's using jQuery will typically break as soon as you introduce something that causes a conflict. So again, using the Firebug tool is a great way to check if you have a problem with your JavaScript, with your jQuery. So you can get that online. It works in Firefox. There's also a Chrome version, although not quite as powerful as the Firefox version. But what it will tell you is, for example, here, it's telling me, well, you know, I have this fancy box object with a build function. It's not a function. And so something exited right away. I got this specific message by installing 2 plugins that were trying to load this fancy box jQuery library, and they conflicted with each other. So the typical culprits, the typical reasons why you have jQuery issues. The first one is there's more than one copy of jQuery that gets loaded. So your theme could be loading its own copy of jQuery. Each of the plugins that you've installed could be trying to load their own. In the best of worlds, they would have nicely requested for WordPress to bring up its copy of the library, the jQuery library, and then only one copy would have been loaded. But in reality, a lot of authors will either load up their own and package it with their plugin or their theme, or they're going to load up a copy from a place like the Google API site. So in all of these cases, you're going to end up with more than one copy loaded, and they tend to clobber each other. So if you have a first copy of jQuery that loads, it does a bit of setup, and then a second one loads, it'll just wipe out everything that the first one did. The way you're going to find out if this is what happened is just by looking at the source code on the web page. So you'd be looking at your source code and looking for jQuery.js and see if you have more than one instance of that library being loaded. The one you typically want to see is one that's going to be inside of the WordPress directories itself. But if you see other copies that come from your theme or your plugin, well, that gives you a good track to know who to contact to be able to look at removing that extra load of the jQuery library. Other one could be you could have an incompatible version of jQuery that gets loaded. So very often, plugins or themes are going to be created to work with a specific version of jQuery. And they might have third-party libraries, JavaScript libraries, that also depend on a specific version of jQuery. Well, if somebody has on their website a plugin to optimize, and I use that word a bit loosely, but to optimize, they might have done things like try to override which library gets loaded for jQuery and load one again from the Google API site. But that version might be the latest version if they did not pay attention, and they'll end up with a version of jQuery that's not the same as the one from WordPress. Thus, any developer who's relying on a specific version, the one that came with WordPress, will run into issues. You might have multiple versions of a JavaScript or a jQuery library that's loaded. So here I'm not talking about jQuery itself, but any of the helper libraries that can be loaded by a plugin. If there's more than one of your plugins that is using that same helper library, but different versions, that could give you some problems. The last thing is you could have a theme or a plugin that has jQuery code that's using the unavailable jQuery shorthand. So jQuery, if you're familiar with it, offers this $ shorthand that can be used. Now, the copy of jQuery that comes with WordPress does not define that shorthand. So if you have things that try to use it, typically more on the theme side, but still, if you have things that try to use it and it's not available, it could break. So you could either use the proper long-form jQuery, or you could look at recreating that shorthand through code. So to illustrate in this case the dual library of the same name but different versions, in this case we had this fancy box script, and this relates to the error I showed you a few slides back, being loaded by 2 different plugins. So I had this fancy box gallery plugin and this modal dialog plugin, both loading fancy box but different versions of it. So one got on top of the other, they didn't have the exact same set of functions defined, things break. Now, of course, here, the main thing that you can do if you get in this kind of situation is get in touch with the plugin authors. Could be on both sides. You could ask one plugin author, could you look at upgrading? Or see if there's a way that maybe if they detect that that library is already loaded, not load theirs, that kind of thing. So there's a few different ways that you can look at addressing that type of problem. Unfortunately, it's more on the developer end than on the user side that you could look at getting this to be corrected. Troubleshooting upload issues. So there's various plugins that could give users the ability to go and upload extra files, whether it be loading images, loading data files. I myself have a few plugins that let users upload different content. Now there's a few things that could happen when you try to use that functionality but it's not working as it should. The first problem you could have is a lack of permissions. A lot of these plugins are going to upload content to the upload folder. Now if the permissions on that folder are not set so that users can upload files, these uploads will fail. Now, you may get a very clear error message telling you that there's a problem with these permissions, but it really depends on how the plugin developer wrote his code. In other cases, you might get some strange error saying, well, I can't find this file, or there's no data. In all of these cases, you might start to know that there's a problem with the file not being able to be written. If you are able to write files, but you still have issues, the next problem you could have is that the files that you're trying to upload might be too big. Now, this is actually not something that's controlled by WordPress. It's something that's configured inside of your server under the PHP ini file. So it's completely outside the WordPress install, and excuse me, most often the default here is 8 megabytes. So that can be a bit small if you're looking at uploading zip files or any kind of large file. Excuse me. So, so how you figure out here if you're dealing with an issue with the size is there's many different plugins that will let you see what is the configuration of your server. So one example of this is the WordPress PHP info plugin. So you install that plugin, and then you're going to see a list of all of these configuration parameters. Now, I've only shown you here the top of what it displays and the parameter of interest here, the upload max file size. But there's actually a ton of different parameters here that gets listed on the site. But if you just search for the keyword upload, well, you'll see whether or not you're dealing with a limit. Once you figure out if you are, and if the file you're trying to upload is bigger, then you need to figure out with your hosting company what's the way to go and change that parameter. Different hosts have different techniques to do that. If you're lucky, it's just an easy cPanel configuration on your provider's control panel. Otherwise, you might need to go and write a specific file, put it in the right place, etc., but to be able to increase that limit. Now, the next topic I want to talk about is how to deal with problematic updates. So you might have installed a plugin and it worked fine, and it worked fine for a very long time. But at one point down the road, you go and run an update and something is not so fine. Something broke on your website. It could be your entire site stopped working. You know, I talked about the white screen of death earlier. Could be that all your JavaScript base code stopped working. Could be that you're not getting the output you expected to get from the plugin. If you had a shortcode somewhere on your web page, instead of getting your nice content, you might just be seeing that shortcode. In any of these cases, you uploaded a plugin and you ended up losing functionality over what you had before, so you're dealing with a bad update. First thing, don't panic. There's always a way back. You'll get there, but don't panic. Next, look at deactivating and reactivating any plugin that you just updated. Hopefully you remember which ones these are. If you have a very long list, just do them all, just to be sure. What this might do is it will just make sure that activation routines are going to be executed on the plugin. So some plugins do have their own database content. Some plugins are going to have their own settings. And by having these activation routines be executed, they'll have a chance to go through and make sure that they're going to be able to update things, make sure they create new default values for some of their new options. So normally that's supposed to happen when you do the update, but if it did not, you know, think of it as a reboot. When it doesn't work, something doesn't work on your computer sometimes, just reboot it. It's going to put things back in place. That's basically the same thing for a plugin here. It'll just deactivate, reactivate. Some code might get executed, and then will run. The other thing I want to mention here is that doing this is essential if you're uploading plugins on your own. So if you're not using the built-in update mechanism, most people do use it, but I have seen a few users who are still a bit more old school and just uploading plugins themselves via FTP. Well, in that case, if you just upload the plugin over the old version of the files, the plugin will not have had the chance to run that activation routine. It will not have had the chance to look at initializing new things or making sure that you have proper defaults for new options. So it's important to do that, at least try that after an update and see if that resolves your issue. The next thing you might want to look at is, well, are there any error messages? And so this includes error messages that show up on the page right away, or things like debug messages. So if you have a plugin like WP Debug installed, looking at if there's any new kind of debugging information that shows up that could give you a hint as to which plugin had an issue or what is the problem with that plugin. If both of these fail to get you back on the right path, well, you might want to try to revert back to the previous version of the plugin that you have from your recent backup, right? Everybody's got a backup. Everybody makes a backup just before they update their plugins. Okay, maybe not, but if you did, great. You can just go back to that old version you knew worked, get it back on there, and be on your merry way. If you did not have a backup of that version of the plugin, the next place that you can look at is looking for previous versions on the WordPress site. So under a plugins page, you'll have this developer tab, and this will list other versions down here. And typically that will have a listing of all the different versions that might be there. So you can look at what version you're currently running on, look at downloading a previous version, uploading that to your server, cross your fingers, and then see that it hopefully fixes the issue you were having. Now, that can be great if it's all listed, but that is not the case for all plugins. I'll have to make a confession. This is one of my plugins. I don't mark my versions, so you don't get a listing of these versions in here. I'm probably not the only plugin developer that's not tagging their versions, and I swear I'm going to start to do it soon. Until then, though, if you hit a plugin page that's like this one, where you only have the most recent version, you still have a problem. You still don't have that precious previous version that you want to try to reinstall to be able to get back on track. So the next thing that you can look at if you're in this situation is looking at really digging deeper to find that previous version of your plugin. On that same page that I just showed you, this developer tab, you have this browse and track link. Track is a web-based interface on top of what's called Subversion. So there's a Subversion system that is the place where all of the plugins on WordPress.org are being stored. So if you click on this track link, you'll get this very up-to-date looking page with the very, very good old WordPress logo from the good old days. This has not changed for about 8 years. But it's still active. All the files for all the plugins are up to date on this. And so what you'll see here is the content of the plugin. You'll typically have 3 directories under here: branches, tags, and trunk. Branches you shouldn't look at. Tags, well, if you're in this situation and you're digging in here, that's because the author did not make a tag, so there's no sense in looking in there. And trunk is typically going to be the current version of that plugin you're looking at. So if you were to click on that trunk, you'll get a listing of that plugin's files. And under here, you'll find a link for what's called a revision log. So the revision log, if you click on it, will give you a listing of all of the check-ins, all of the uploads that plugin's author has done over time. Typically, you'll have a log message that will give you things like version number, or at least you'll have a timestamp on these different entries. Now, what you can do in this wonderful tool is you can look at selecting the current version, which is going to be the latest one here on top, and make sure you select that version on the left-hand column. And then you're going to choose a target version, which would be one of the older ones, in the right-hand column. So we have just these 2 little dots over here. Once you've done that, you can hit the View Changes button up top. And what you'll get is 2 things. You'll get a lot of text. Well, actually, that might depend on how many changes the author did, but you'll have basically a listing of all these different changes. But the other great thing you'll get at the very bottom of the page is the ability to download a zip archive. This will let you download a version of that previous version of the plugin. It will only contain the files that changed. So if only half the files change, this will only contain half of these files. So once you have that zip archive, you want to look at uploading it to your server, but you don't want to delete what's on your server. You just want to reapply these older versions of the files on top, because otherwise you won't have a complete plugin on there. The next thing is you should stop updating that plugin, of course. You know that there's something wrong. Stop updating for a little bit. Maybe look at the change logs that are being published by the author on the WordPress.org site and see if and when there's a resolution for that problem, hopefully sooner rather than later. But do look at that, otherwise, well, skip back a few slides and start these steps all over again. Last topic that I'm going to be touching upon today is how to avoid bad plugin breakups. So you might have found the best plugin in the world, you might have installed it, you might have fought through getting it to work, but some point down the road, that relationship might not be what it used to be, and you might want to think about using a different plugin or getting rid of it completely. So there's two types of breakups that could occur here. User triggered, so you might not be where you want to be in that relationship, you might not want it to continue because you might have found a better solution. Or that functionality that you had added through a plugin, you realize over time that, you know what, I'm not using this anymore, it's just there for no reason, so let's remove it. Or things could happen on the plugin side. The plugin could be converting to a premium model. Some plugins have been doing that over the last few years. So in that case, if you're not willing to invest in that plugin, well, you might need to look for a different solution. The plugin might just have stopped development or might not be supporting new versions. So sometimes you get into this situation where the author just left that plugin untouched for a long time. Or they might not just be the quickest at looking at supporting a new version of WordPress. So in both of these cases, you might have updated right away and you're not able to use that plugin correctly. So to prepare for all of these different situations, well, there's a few things that I recommend. The first thing that I want to mention here is that plugins may be storing information in your database. Actually, most of them are. They could be storing that information in a variety of different ways. They could be using custom fields. They could be using custom post types. They could be using custom tables. Wherever that data is, or sometimes in the core WordPress tables. But wherever that data is, not all the developers think about what's going to happen when you stop using their plugins. To them, well, you're using their tool, you're all set, but they don't think about, well, what happens if you deactivate it? So as soon as you've installed a plugin, as soon as you've selected it, you start to use it, before you use it for too long, look at what the effects are if you deactivate it. Look at what's going to happen to your website if you hit that deactivate link. Now there's a few things that could happen. You could just have a clean removal. That's the best case scenario. You had a widget, you remove the plugin, the widget's gone, you're fine. But there's other cases that might happen. First one is, well, okay, so you added all this extra data with the plugin. When you remove it, how easy is it for you to get access to this information? How did the author store that data inside of your website? Do you have a way, using tools like phpMyAdmin, but do you have a way to be able to go back and get that information so that you've not lost everything when you deactivate that plugin? The next thing to look at, which is even a bit more dangerous, is did that plugin modify any core data? Here I'm thinking about plugins like WPML in the old days, where it used to go in and put all these nice tags within your post content to identify the English and the French versions. And once you deactivated, well, you ended up with a mess on your website. I don't know if it's still like that today, but you do want to make sure that you don't have a plugin that could leave a lot of stuff, not to say the C word, on your website all over the place. Last case, which hopefully wouldn't happen, but you can end up with a site that doesn't work, and then you need to go back and figure out why your site does not work. But it's good to do that up front. Just be aware of, okay, I've installed this plugin, I like what it does, but if for some reason down the road I think I need to stop to use it, then you know at least what's going to happen. So, to conclude, plugins are really amazing tools that can really greatly enhance your website. I use them every day. I build plugins, as I've said, to start this up. So I think they're amazing, and they really make WordPress an awesome platform. But they're big liabilities. As you build up your website, you could run into issues, and it's always dangerous to figure out what's the right combination of plugins to be able to get to your end result. When you use them with caution, really possibilities are infinite. So if you do it right, well, you could end up with a nice website like this. Everything nicely stacked up on each other, solid foundation, and then you're able to move forward. A few recommended readings. If you'd like to learn more about developing plugins, well, I wrote a book on the subject, which was published last year. And you can learn all about how to write plugins from A to Z inside of this book. And if you're actually interested in getting a copy, you can use this discount code. Very easy, WC Montreal 13 on the Packet Pub website. This will work until August 1st. You get 75% off the ebook. Other place you might want to look, I talked about using the support site. So looking under the support website for WordPress will give you tons of resources to be able to help you troubleshoot issues, help you figure out how to move forward in using your plugins. And finally, I want to say that this presentation is available on my website. Are there any questions? You can use the microphone just right there, just so everyone can hear.
Hi. Just that part where you were showing all the different jQueries loading, like the fancy box, when you had a whole list of all the different ones.
Yes.
How would you know what plugin they were coming from?
Let me just go back to the page. We'll get there. You would actually know by looking at the plugin path. So for example here, I can see WP Content, Plugins, Fancy Box Gallery. So that's the name of one of the plugins. And then WP Content, Plugins, Modal Dialog. So typically, you'll have the plugin name within the path. The other places it could come would be from the theme. So that would be WP Content Themes, something, if the theme has its own version. Or you might see like a Google API address or something like that, which would tell you that there's a copy being loaded from the Google API site. No other questions? I guess I was crystal clear. Oh.
One more question.
Sure.
You mentioned that some plugins like to use, I guess, the jQuery off of Google's site versus off of the local WordPress. Which would you recommend?
I typically always prefer the one that's in WordPress. As I said, the first thing is the fact that it's a slightly different version of jQuery. That being said, if they've done it right, if they've properly looked at queuing up a version of jQuery that's the correct version of jQuery and made sure that no other version would get loaded, then that's acceptable. But the problem is often people use that as a shortcut and they don't make sure that they meet all these criteria. So to me, one file that's, it's not the biggest file in the world, one file to get loaded off your local server as opposed to the small speed gain you might get from loading it outside, you're not gaining a lot for something that could cause you trouble. All right. Well, thank you very much for attending my talk. And enjoy the rest of the weekend.